Tonight, you are about to begin a long and gentle journey through time, memory, and place. This story is designed to move slowly, without urgency, allowing your mind to relax as history unfolds at an easy, peaceful pace. What you are listening to is a calm exploration of a city shaped by water, land, people, patience, and resilience. A story that does not rush forward, but instead invites you to rest as it moves quietly through the past. This documentary sleep story follows the long and layered history of Chicago, from the natural landscape that existed long before streets and buildings, through early settlement, growth, hardship, recovery, and into the modern era. Every chapter is told with care, focusing not on noise or drama, but on atmosphere, daily life, and the steady rhythm of time passing. You do not need to remember dates, names, or details. This is not a lesson to study, but a story to drift through. If your attention wanders, that is perfectly fine. If your eyes grow heavy and sleep arrives before the story ends, that is exactly how this video is meant to be experienced. The narration is intentionally slow and smooth, designed for deep relaxation and long listening. You may choose to listen actively, or simply let the words fade into the background as your body rests and your breathing slows. There is no right way to listen, only a calm way. As the story moves forward, you will hear about landscapes shaped by time, communities forming gently, cities rising and rebuilding, and everyday life unfolding through routine and repetition. Each section connects naturally to the next, creating a continuous flow that is ideal for sleep, rest, or quiet reflection. This video is part of the Past to Sleep channel, a space created for those who enjoy history told slowly, softly, and without tension. Here, stories are not rushed. They are meant to be companions in the quiet hours, helping you unwind after long days and find rest through calm storytelling. If you enjoy this kind of content, you are warmly invited to support the channel. A simple like helps more people discover these peaceful history stories. Subscribing allows you to return whenever you need calm, comfort, or sleep. And if you feel like sharing your thoughts, leaving a comment is always welcome, whether you stayed awake through the whole story or drifted off halfway through. Now, settle in comfortably. Lower the volume if needed. Let your breathing slow. And allow this long, gentle journey through Chicago's history to carry you peacefully into rest. Number 1. The natural landscape before Chicago, before there was a city, before streets, buildings, or names written on maps. The land that would one day become Chicago existed in a slow and patient state of balance. Time moved gently here, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by seasons, water levels, wind and light. The landscape breathed quietly, shaped by forces far older than memory, carrying rhythms that repeated themselves without hurry. Long before human structures appeared, glaciers had passed through this region, advancing and retreating with immense weight and silence. As they moved, they reshaped the earth beneath them, flattening land, carving paths, and leaving behind rich soil. When the ice finally withdrew, it revealed a wide, open terrain, prairies stretching toward distant horizons, wetlands shimmering under changing skies, and waterways slowly finding their paths toward larger bodies of water. One of the most defining features of this land was water. Rivers flowed calmly, linking lakes, marshes, and lowlands together in an interconnected system. These waterways were not dramatic or fast-moving. They curved gently, changing course over time, responding to rain, snowmelt, and the natural slope of the land. Water collected, lingered, and moved on, shaping everything it touched. Nearby, a vast lake rested with quiet authority. Its surface reflected the sky in endless variations of light and color. Some days it lay smooth and still, other days restless under wind. Yet it remained constant, offering a sense of permanence. The presence of this water moderated the climate, softening extremes, influencing weather patterns, and sustaining life across the region. The prairies surrounding the waterways were wide and open, covered in tall grasses that swayed gently in the wind. These grasses grew deep roots, anchoring the soil and allowing the land to recover naturally from fire and drought. In spring and summer, the prairie came alive with subtle movement and sound. In winter, it rested beneath snow and silence, conserving energy for the cycle to begin again. Wetlands formed where water gathered and lingered. These areas were rich with life, supporting birds, fish, and plants adapted to slow-moving waters. Marshes filtered and cleaned water naturally, maintaining balance without intervention. They changed with the seasons, expanding and shrinking, never fixed in form, always adjusting. The land did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader system connecting forests to the east, plains to the west, and waterways that linked distant regions together. Movement across this land was possible, but it required patience and understanding. There were no straight lines, no fixed paths. Travel followed the logic of nature, bending where the land bent, slowing where water slowed. Animal life moved freely through this environment. Herds passed quietly through open spaces. Birds followed seasonal routes, arriving and departing with the changing year. Smaller creatures lived close to the ground, shaping soil and vegetation in subtle ways. Each form of life played its role, maintaining balance through interaction rather than control. Human presence arrived gradually, quietly, and respectfully. Indigenous peoples lived within this landscape rather than upon it. Their relationship with the land was shaped by observation and adaptation. They learned its rhythms, understood its limits, and moved in harmony with its cycles. Their settlements were not permanent in the modern sense. They shifted with seasons, allowing the land time to rest and renew. Daily life followed the land's cues. When water levels rose, movement changed. When grasses grew tall, animals gathered. When winter approached, preparation replaced travel. Knowledge passed down through generations ensured survival without domination. The land was not something to conquer. It was something to listen to. The rivers served as guides, offering routes of travel and connection. They allowed movement between regions without cutting through the land aggressively. Canoes moved quietly along their surfaces, leaving no trace behind. Camps formed near water, then dissolved again, returning space to silence. Fire played a careful role in shaping the prairie. Controlled burns prevented overgrowth, renewed soil, and encouraged healthy ecosystems. These fires were not destructive forces, but tools used with understanding and restraint. Afterward, the land returned greener and more balanced than before. Seasons passed with dependable rhythm. Spring brought renewal, water, and growth. Summer offered abundance and long days. Autumn signaled preparation and transition. Winter slowed everything, encouraging stillness and reflection. This cycle repeated endlessly, teaching patience through repetition. There were no boundaries drawn here, no ownership defined by lines. Space belonged to movement, to change, to time itself. The land was open, shared, and fluid. It invited presence without demanding permanence. Sound in this world was gentle, wind through grass, water against shore. Bird calls carried across distance. Silence was common and comfortable, not empty but full of subtle awareness. Night arrived without artificial light, allowing stars to dominate the sky. Darkness was not feared, it was expected. The land held memory, not in structures but in patterns. Paths formed where movement repeated, then faded when movement changed. Marks left by weather softened over time. Nothing was meant to last forever in one form. Change was accepted as natural rather than disruptive. This landscape did not rush toward the future. It existed fully in the present, carrying the past gently, and allowing the future to arrive in its own time. There was no pressure to grow, expand, or accelerate. Balance mattered more than progress. As centuries passed, this calm environment continued to sustain life quietly. It remained largely unchanged, even as distant regions experienced transformation. The land waited without expectation, holding its rivers, prairies, and wetlands in steady harmony. When later generations would arrive with different intentions, they would encounter a place already complete in its own way. A place shaped by patience rather than ambition. A place whose greatest strength lay in its ability to endure without effort. As you imagine this earliest chapter, picture wide, open land beneath a vast sky. Feel the slow movement of water. Hear the quiet wind across grass. Let your thoughts move as gently as the landscape itself. This was the world before the city, before noise, before structure. A land resting in balance, unhurried and whole, waiting quietly as time continued its endless calm flow. As time continued to pass across the land that would one day become Chicago, the landscape remained steady in its quiet rhythm. Nothing here hurried toward change. The earth, the water, and the sky existed in a patient conversation, repeating familiar patterns again and again. Each year followed the last with gentle variation, never straying far from balance. The prairie grasses continued to rise and fall with the seasons. In warmer months, they grew tall and full, bending softly under the wind. Their movement created waves across the land, like a calm sea made of green and gold. These grasses were strong, rooted deep into the soil, holding the earth together beneath the surface. Even when fire passed through, the roots remained unharmed, ready to bring life back once more. Rain arrived gradually, soaking into the ground rather than rushing away. Water collected in shallow basins, forming wetlands that changed shape throughout the year. These wetlands were neither land nor water completely. They existed in between, creating spaces where life flourished quietly. Frogs, birds, insects, and plants all depended on these slow, shallow waters. The nearby lake continued its steady presence, shaping the air and weather around it. Mornings often began cool and calm, with mist rising gently from the surface. Afternoons brought shifting light, and evenings settled into long reflections of sky and cloud. The lake did not announce itself loudly, yet its influence reached far inland, moderating heat and cold alike. Rivers meandered through this environment without force. They were not carved suddenly, but formed over time, choosing paths that felt natural rather than direct. Their banks supported reeds, grasses, and trees that leaned toward the water. In spring, the rivers swelled, spreading into surrounding lowlands. In drier times, they pulled back, leaving fertile ground behind. Trees appeared where conditions allowed. Groves formed along waterways and in sheltered areas, offering contrast to the open prairie. These wooded spaces provided shade, protection, and resources. Leaves changed color with the seasons, falling quietly to the ground and returning nutrients to the soil. Animal life moved through these spaces with awareness rather than urgency. Herds traveled slowly, guided by memory and instinct. Birds nested in tall grasses and trees, filling the air with soft sound at dawn and dusk. Predators and prey existed within an unspoken balance, each shaping the other's behavior without excess. Human life continued to exist as part of this system. Indigenous communities understood the land deeply, not through ownership but through relationship. Their movement followed the seasons. Their shelters were built to blend into the environment, offering protection without permanence. When it was time to move, traces were minimal, allowing the land to recover fully. Daily activities were shaped by observation. People watched the sky for weather. They listened to animals for signs of change. Knowledge was passed down carefully, ensuring survival without overuse of resources. Tools were simple and purposeful, made to serve without disrupting balance. Travel across the land followed natural routes. Rivers guided movement, offering reliable paths through otherwise open terrain. Trails formed where feet passed repeatedly, then faded when no longer needed. There were no straight lines, no forced directions. Movement adapted to the land rather than reshaping it. Fire continued to play a controlled role. Small intentional burns refreshed the prairie, preventing dense growth and encouraging new plants. These fires were part of a cycle, not an act of destruction. Afterward, the land returned richer and more open than before. Winter brought stillness. Snow covered the prairie, muting sound and movement. Rivers slowed beneath ice. Life retreated inward, conserving energy. This period of rest was not seen as absence, but as preparation. Beneath the surface, roots held firm, waiting for warmth to return. Spring arrived gradually, melting snow and filling waterways. Life emerged again, not suddenly, but steadily. Birds returned, plants reached upward. The cycle continued without interruption. as it had for countless generations. Sound remained soft and layered. Wind, water, and wildlife created a natural rhythm. Silence was common and comforting. Night skies remained dark and expansive, allowing stars to shine clearly. The absence of artificial light made darkness feel natural, even welcoming. There were no fixed boundaries here. Space was shared, fluid, and responsive. The land was not divided into parcels or measured for value. Its worth lay in its ability to sustain life calmly and consistently. Time itself felt different in this environment. Without clocks or schedules, days were guided by light and need. Years were remembered through events and seasons rather than numbers. Life unfolded at a pace that allowed reflection and adjustment. This landscape did not anticipate what was to come. It did not prepare for roads, buildings, or crowds. It simply existed, complete in its own form. The land did not resist change, but it did not invite it either. It waited. As centuries continued, the prairie, wetlands, rivers, and lake remained in quiet harmony. They absorbed weather, fire, movement, and rest without losing balance. This resilience came from flexibility rather than strength, from patience rather than force. As you imagine this phase of the land story, picture long days under open skies. See water moving slowly through reeds. Feel the gentle wind across tall grass. Allow your thoughts to move at the same pace, unhurried and light. This was a world without urgency, a place where time passed gently, a landscape complete without needing to become anything else. Long before streets and structures appeared, this land rested in its natural state, holding balance quietly as it always had, waiting calmly as the future approached at its own slow, inevitable pace. As the centuries continued to pass, the land that would eventually become Chicago remained deeply rooted in its own quiet order. Nothing here pushed toward transformation. The earth held its shape gently, allowing water, wind, and living creatures to guide its slow evolution. This was a place where change happened so gradually that it felt almost invisible, woven softly into the passing of time. The prairie stretched wide and open, offering uninterrupted views of sky and horizon. Tall grasses responded to even the smallest movement of air, leaning and rising again with effortless grace. These grasses protected the soil beneath them, shielding it from erosion and holding moisture through dry periods. Their strength was hidden underground, where roots spread deep and wide, anchoring the land with quiet persistence. Wetlands continued to serve as the land's calm center. Water gathered here without urgency, forming shallow pools and marshy ground that shifted gently with the seasons. These spaces were alive with subtle activity. Insects hovered near the surface. Birds arrived and departed in steady patterns. Fish moved through narrow channels, guided by instinct rather than speed. The lake remained vast and steady, its presence shaping the land without force. Storms passed over its surface, sometimes stirring waves, sometimes leaving it mirror smooth. The lake stored heat and cold, releasing them slowly, creating a rhythm that softened the surrounding climate. Its shoreline changed over time, shaped by wind and water rather than intention. Rivers continued their slow journeys, connecting this region to distant places. They were not obstacles, but invitations, offering passage and connection. Their banks shifted gently, creating new curves and bends over long periods. Sediment settled quietly, enriching the soil and supporting new growth. Forested areas appeared and disappeared depending on conditions. Trees clustered where water and shelter allowed them to thrive, offering contrast to the open prairie. These groves provided protection from wind and sun, creating pockets of stillness. Leaves fell and returned nutrients to the earth, completing cycles that required no intervention. Animal life followed well-worn patterns. Large animals moved with awareness, never exhausting the land. Smaller creatures shaped the environment in subtle ways, aerating soil and spreading seeds. Birds marked time through migration, their arrival signaling seasonal shifts long before temperature changed. Human life remained deeply connected to this rhythm. Indigenous communities continued to live with awareness rather than control. They observed changes carefully, adjusting movement and activity in response. Their knowledge was practical, patient, and respectful, built over generations of close relationship with the land. Shelters were temporary, designed to meet needs without permanence. When seasons changed, movement followed naturally. Camps formed and dissolved without leaving lasting scars. Tools were crafted to serve immediate purpose, then repaired or replaced as needed, never accumulating beyond usefulness. Food was gathered and prepared with care. Hunting, fishing, and harvesting followed rules shaped by observation rather than enforcement. Taking only what was needed ensured balance. Waste was minimal. Everything returned to the land in time. Fire remained an essential part of maintaining the prairie. Used carefully, it prevented dense growth and renewed nutrients. After burns, fresh green shoots appeared quickly, restoring life with remarkable speed. This cycle repeated itself endlessly, a quiet collaboration between human understanding and natural process. Winter continued to bring deep stillness. Snow softened the landscape, reducing sound and movement. Animals adapted, conserving energy. Humans slowed their activities, turning inward. Stories were shared. Knowledge was passed along. Rest was accepted as necessary, not resisted. Spring arrived gradually, never all at once. Ice loosened. Water flowed freely again. Life returned in stages, each signal followed by another. Nothing rushed. Growth unfolded naturally, responding to light and warmth. The absence of permanent structures allowed the land to remain flexible. There were no roads to redirect water, no buildings to block wind, no lights to alter night. Darkness remained complete and peaceful, allowing stars to dominate the sky. Night was not empty. It was full of quiet awareness. Time itself felt expansive here. Days were guided by light and weather rather than obligation. Years blended into one another, marked by memory rather than record. The land did not measure time, it experienced it. There was no sense of waiting for something more. The land did not imagine a future city. It did not anticipate crowds or noise. It existed fully in the present, complete and balanced, carrying its own meaning without needing addition. This quiet completeness is what made the land resilient. When change eventually arrived, it would encounter a place already shaped by patience and adaptability. The prairie had learned how to bend without breaking. The wetlands knew how to absorb and release. The rivers understood movement without force. As you imagine this final moment before transformation, picture a wide, open landscape under a slow-moving sky. Feel the stillness of air at dusk. Hear water moving gently through reeds. Sense the deep calm of a place that belongs entirely to itself. This was the land before the city, before names and borders, before structure and speed, a place shaped by balance, guided by cycles, and held together by quiet endurance. And as time continued its steady flow, this land rested calmly, unaware of what would one day rise upon it, holding its silence gently, complete and untroubled, as the future approached slowly, without sound. Number 2, early exploration and strategic settlement long after the land had settled into its natural rhythm. Quiet and complete, the first distant signs of change began to appear in the region that would become Chicago. This change did not arrive suddenly or forcefully. It came slowly, carried by footsteps, paddles, and curiosity. The landscape did not resist. It simply observed, absorbing each new presence into its wide and patient stillness. The earliest explorers who reached this area were drawn not by beauty alone, but by possibility. They followed waterways that connected distant regions, guided by rivers that flowed calmly through marsh and prairie. These routes had existed long before maps were drawn. They were known through experience rather than record, shaped by generations of movement that left little trace behind. Travel through this land required attentiveness. The ground shifted from firm prairie to soft wetland without warning. Waterways curved and changed with seasons. Movement was slow, deliberate, and quiet. Canoes glided through shallow channels, their passage barely disturbing the surface. Travelers learned quickly that this was not a place to rush. It demanded patience. The meeting of rivers near the lake created a natural point of connection. Here, Water allowed passage between vast interior lands and distant shores. This subtle junction held strategic importance long before it was named or claimed. It offered access rather than control, movement rather than settlement. Those who passed through understood its value intuitively. Early European explorers arrived carrying different intentions. They observed the land with interest shaped by trade and expansion. Yet even they could not ignore the challenges of the environment. The wetlands resisted permanence, the seasons dictated movement. Attempts to impose structure met with quiet difficulty. Trade emerged as the earliest sustained interaction. Furs, tools, and goods moved along the waterways, exchanged through relationships rather than authority. Small trading posts appeared briefly, then disappeared. These early presences were light, almost temporary, leaving the land largely unchanged. Indigenous communities remained central to this period. Their knowledge guided newcomers through unfamiliar terrain. They understood where water could be crossed, where ground would hold, where shelter could be found. Without this guidance, movement would have stalled. The land revealed itself only to those who listened. Daily life during this era remained simple and mobile. Camps were established where conditions allowed, then abandoned as needs changed. Structures were minimal, designed to meet immediate purpose without permanence. Firelight flickered briefly against the vast darkness, then faded. The environment continued to shape every decision. Spring floods expanded waterways, slowing travel. Summer brought growth and insects. Autumn signaled preparation. Winter closed routes entirely, covering land and water in silence. Movement adjusted rather than resisted. The idea of settlement began to take shape gradually. It was not driven by comfort, but by location. The junction of water routes offered opportunity for exchange and connection. Even then, permanence was uncertain. The land tested every attempt to stay. Early structures struggled against moisture and weather. Wood softened, ground shifted, supplies were difficult to transport. These challenges kept growth slow and cautious. The land allowed presence, but not dominance. Sound remained minimal. Wind, water, and distant voices blended together. Silence was still the dominant presence. Even human activity felt subdued, aware of its smallness within the open landscape. Time passed without urgency. Days were shaped by light and need. There was no sense of building towards something larger yet. Each moment stood on its own, complete. This period was defined by balance between movement and pause. Exploration did not erase the land's character. Settlement did not yet demand transformation. Everything remained tentative. The lake watched quietly. Rivers continued their slow paths. Prairie grasses bent and rose again. The land accepted footsteps without remembering them. As you imagine this chapter, picture canoes moving through misty water, small fires glowing briefly at dusk, conversations carried softly across open space. Feel the patience required to exist here. This was not the beginning of a city yet. It was the beginning of awareness, a recognition of place, a quiet understanding of potential. The land did not change its rhythm. It simply allowed new movement within it. And so, early exploration passed gently through this region, leaving behind not structures or borders, but the first faint sense that this quiet junction of water and land might one day become something more, slowly, carefully, and without haste. As exploration continued quietly across the land that would one day become Chicago, the idea of this place as more than a passing route began to settle gently into human thought. It did not happen through grand decisions or sudden ambition. It happened through repetition, through people returning again and again to the same stretch of water, the same open ground, the same calm meeting point between lake, river, and prairie. The landscape itself encouraged this return. Travelers noticed how naturally movement gathered here. Canoes arriving from distant inland waterways could pause, rest, and then continue onward toward the lake. Goods moved slowly through hands, exchanged not in crowded markets but in quiet, practical moments. The land did not push people away, but it did not make staying easy either. It asked for patience in exchange for access. Explorers learned to read the land more carefully over time. What looked flat and open from a distance revealed subtle changes up close. Slight rises in ground offered dryness. Narrow channels allowed passage through wetlands. Wind direction mattered. Water depth changed daily. Survival depended on attention rather than force. Maps were drawn slowly and imperfectly. Early records captured impressions more than precision. The land resisted being simplified. Rivers shifted. Shorelines changed. What was marked one year could look different the next. This instability discouraged rigid planning and encouraged flexible thinking. Trade continued to define the earliest form of settlement. It required presence but not permanence. Small groups stayed for weeks or months, then moved on. Storage was limited. Structures were light and temporary. The land remained largely untouched, absorbing activity without retaining it. Relationships mattered more than boundaries. Trust built slowly through repeated encounters. Knowledge of routes, seasons, and resources was shared carefully. Misunderstandings occurred, but so did cooperation. The land itself shaped these interactions, reminding everyone that survival depended on collaboration rather than control. As more explorers passed through, awareness of the area spread outward. Stories traveled farther than people. This place became known as a connector, a quiet hinge between regions. Its value lay not in what it produced, but in what it allowed: movement, exchange, and rest. The idea of permanent foothold emerged gradually, not as a city, but as a reliable stop, a place where supplies could be replenished, where routes could be adjusted, where decisions could pause. This shift in perception marked an important change. The land was no longer just passed through, it was considered. Still, permanence remained fragile. Floods washed away paths, wet ground resisted construction. Harsh winters isolated those who lingered too long. Each attempt to stay was tested. Those who adapted learned to build lightly, to remain flexible, to accept that nothing here would stay fixed for long. Sound remained minimal. Activity did not overwhelm silence. Even human voices seemed to respect the openness, carrying softly and fading quickly. Night returned fully, uninterrupted by artificial light. Darkness was deep and complete, allowing rest without distraction. Time passed unevenly. Busy moments of trade and travel were followed by long stretches of quiet. The land alternated between brief presence and extended absence. This rhythm prevented rapid growth. Everything unfolded slowly, as if the land itself regulated pace. Seasons continued to dictate behavior. Spring brought movement as waterways opened. Summer allowed longer stays. Autumn encouraged preparation. Winter enforced retreat. These cycles shaped early settlement more than any plan or intention. Gradually, familiarity replaced novelty. The land was no longer unknown. It became predictable in its unpredictability. People learned what to expect without assuming control. This understanding laid the foundation for future decisions. Even if those decisions were still far away, there was no sense yet of ownership in the modern sense. Presence was temporary. Claims were informal. Space remained shared. The land did not belong to anyone in a fixed way. It allowed use, then reclaimed quiet. As you imagine this phase, picture repeated arrivals and departures, canoes resting briefly at shore, footprints appearing, then fading, fires lit and extinguished, the land returning to stillness again and again. This was a time of learning rather than building, of observation rather than transformation. The landscape remained dominant, guiding every action gently but firmly. Exploration continued, settlement hesitated, and the future waited without urgency. And so, this place remained what it had always been, a calm meeting point shaped by water and patience, slowly becoming known, slowly becoming remembered, without yet becoming changed. As exploration continued and familiarity with the land deepened, the region that would become Chicago entered a quiet transitional phase. This was not yet the story of buildings or streets, but it was no longer only a passing landscape either. The land began to hold memory, not through structures, but through repeated presence. People returned not by accident, but by intention, guided by experience rather than curiosity alone. Those who moved through this place now understood its subtle advantages. The meeting of waterways offered access that felt rare and valuable. Inland routes connected gently to the lake, and the lake opened outward toward distant regions. This junction allowed movement without demanding permanence. It invited pause without insisting on settlement. Such balance made it unusual and slowly, quietly important. Travelers began to plan around this place. Routes were adjusted to include it. Journeys were measured with it in mind. It became a reference point, spoken of calmly rather than dramatically. Its importance grew not through proclamation, but through repetition. Each return reinforced its value. The land itself remained unchanged in character. Wet ground still softened underfoot. Water levels continued to rise and fall. Weather shaped every decision. What changed was human awareness. People learned where ground would hold. They learned when water could be crossed. They learned how long one could stay before needing to move again. This knowledge accumulated slowly, passed along through conversation and experience. Temporary structures became slightly more deliberate. Shelters were built with greater care, though still designed to leave little trace. Storage became more organized, but not extensive. Nothing here encouraged excess. The land still resisted permanence, reminding everyone that survival depended on flexibility. Trade deepened quietly. Exchanges became more regular, more predictable. Goods moved through hands with familiarity. Trust built over time, reinforced by shared dependence on the land's rhythms. These interactions were practical rather than ambitious, focused on continuity rather than growth. Indigenous knowledge remained essential. Understanding of seasons, water behavior, and safe movement continued to guide all activity. Without this knowledge, presence here would have remained brief and uncertain. The land revealed itself fully only to those who respected its pace. The idea of settlement existed now as a possibility rather than a plan. It lingered gently, without urgency. People sensed that this place could support more sustained presence, but only if approached carefully. The land did not invite domination, it required cooperation. Silence still defined daily life. Human activity never overwhelmed natural sound. Wind, water, and distant calls remained dominant. Even moments of gathering felt subdued, shaped by the openness of the environment. Nightfall returned the land to darkness completely, allowing rest to come easily. Time continued to feel expansive. Days were long and unstructured. Activity followed need rather than schedule. There was no pressure to build quickly or claim decisively. The future remained undefined, and that uncertainty felt natural rather than troubling. Seasons continued their steady cycle. Each return to the land reinforced understanding of its patterns. Floods, droughts, freezes, and thaws were no longer surprises. They were expected variations, integrated into planning without resistance. What emerged during this period was not a settlement in the traditional sense, but a relationship. The land and its visitors learned one another slowly. Boundaries remained fluid, presence remained respectful. Nothing was forced. This quiet relationship laid the foundation for what would come later. Without drawing lines or raising walls, the land became known. And being known was the first step toward transformation, even if that transformation remained far in the distance. As you imagine this moment, picture a familiar shoreline visited again and again. Supplies unloaded calmly, conversations carried softly, the land unchanged, yet no longer unknown. This was the final calm before permanence began to take shape, a moment balanced between movement and memory. The land remained patient, human intention remained cautious, and together, without hurry, they moved closer to the idea of settlement, not as an act of conquest, but as a gradual decision shaped by understanding, repetition, and time. Number 3. From frontier post to incorporated city, as the quiet period of exploration slowly gave way to something more settled, the land near the rivers and lake began to experience a different kind of presence. What had once been a place of passing through now started to feel like a place where people stayed just a little longer. The change was subtle, almost hesitant, unfolding over years rather than moments. In the region that would become Chicago, the idea of permanence entered gently, without announcement. The earliest signs of this shift appeared in routine. People returned not only because roots demanded it, but because familiarity had grown. The land no longer felt entirely uncertain. Certain paths were known. Certain seasons were understood. This growing knowledge reduced risk and allowed people to imagine staying through more than one cycle of weather. Small structures began to appear with slightly more intention. They were still modest, built from available materials, designed to be practical rather than impressive. These buildings did not dominate the landscape. They sat quietly within it, responding to the land's limits. Wood softened in moisture, foundations adjusted to uneven ground. Every structure reflected compromise rather than control. Daily life remained slow and grounded. Activities followed light, weather, and need. There were no crowded streets or fixed schedules. People rose with the day and rested when darkness returned. Work focused on immediate survival, trading, repairing, preparing for seasonal change. Life felt steady, though still uncertain. The waterways continued to define movement. Boats arrived carrying goods, news, and people. Departures followed arrivals naturally. This gentle flow created a sense of connection to places far beyond the horizon, even as local life remained simple. The land felt less isolated now, though still quiet. As more people lingered, relationships formed. Familiar faces returned season after season. Trust developed slowly, built through shared experience rather than formal agreement. Cooperation mattered. The environment demanded it. Floods, harsh winters, and difficult terrain reminded everyone that survival was collective. The idea of a frontier post emerged during this time. Not a city, not yet even a town, but a recognizable place of gathering. It served practical purposes: exchange, rest, coordination. It did not promise comfort, but it offered reliability. That reliability became its greatest strength. Sound changed slightly. Human voices became more frequent, though still soft. The occasional hammering of wood joined the natural sounds of wind and water. Even so, silence remained dominant. Activity never fully replaced stillness. Time still felt open and unstructured. There were no strict divisions between work and rest. Days blended into one another. Progress was measured not by growth, but by continuity. Each season survived felt like success. As population increased slowly, the need for simple organization emerged. Not laws in the modern sense, but shared expectations. Where to build, when to trade, how to respond to conflict. These understandings developed informally, shaped by necessity rather than authority. The land continued to guide every decision. Wet ground limited expansion. Weather dictated timing. Waterways encouraged certain directions while discouraging others. Growth adapted rather than expanded freely. This stage was defined by balance. Too much permanence would fail. Too little would dissolve. The frontier post existed in between, holding itself together through restraint. As you imagine this phase, picture a small cluster of buildings near water, smoke rising gently at dusk, people moving calmly, aware of one another. The vast landscape still surrounding everything, unchanged and patient. This was not yet a city. It was not yet even confident. It was a place learning how to remain. A quiet beginning of structure within openness, a slow shift from movement to memory. And as time continued its steady pace, this frontier post held on carefully, preparing, without knowing it, for the next transformation that would arrive just as gently, carried forward by routine, patience, and the quiet decision to stay. As time moved forward, the small frontier post near the water slowly began to change in character. What had once felt temporary now carried a growing sense of intention. People no longer stayed only because travel required a pause. They stayed because daily life had begun to take shape. In the place that would become Chicago, routine started to replace uncertainty, and familiarity softened the edges of hardship. The rhythms of the post became more predictable. Boats arrived and departed with increasing regularity. Supplies were expected rather than hoped for. News traveled along with goods, bringing distant events into local conversation. The world felt slightly closer, even as the landscape remained wide and open. Buildings, though still simple, were constructed with more care. People repaired rather than abandoned them. Roofs were strengthened against weather. Walls were reinforced. These actions reflected a quiet confidence that returning next season was no longer a question, but an assumption. The land, once something to endure, began to feel like something that could be lived with. Daily routines became clearer. Mornings began with purposeful movement. Tasks were divided naturally. Some focused on trade, others on maintenance, others on preparation for changing seasons. Work was still demanding, but it felt more organized. Even rest found its place, arriving naturally at day's end. The waterways remained central, but the post itself became a destination rather than just a stop. People planned to meet here. Goods were stored for longer periods. The idea of return became embedded in thought. This subtle shift marked the beginning of permanence. As population grew slowly, social life deepened. Conversations extended beyond immediate needs. People shared stories, memories, and plans. Familiar faces created a sense of belonging. The post was no longer defined only by function, but by community. Simple systems emerged to support daily life. Agreements were made about shared space and responsibilities. These were not formal laws, but understandings shaped by experience. Cooperation remained essential, especially when facing weather extremes or shortages. The environment continued to shape growth. Flooding limited where structures could stand. Harsh winters tested preparation. These challenges prevented rapid expansion, forcing development to remain compact and deliberate. Growth adapted to land rather than reshaping it. Sound changed again. More human activity filled the air during daylight, yet evenings still returned to quiet. Darkness remained deep. Without widespread light, night encouraged rest and reflection. Sleep arrived easily after full days of effort. Time felt both slower and fuller. Days were occupied yet not rushed. Seasons still dictated life, but anticipation replaced uncertainty. People planned ahead, learning how to live through winter rather than escape it. The idea of identity began to form. This place was no longer nameless or interchangeable. It was recognized, remembered, and spoken of with familiarity. Even without formal recognition, it existed in collective awareness. Trade expanded gradually. Goods moved in greater variety. Skills diversified. Some people specialized, offering services beyond basic survival. This diversification supported stability and encouraged people to remain. The post's location continued to prove valuable. Connections between inland routes and the lake strengthened its role as a meeting point. Movement through the region increased, bringing more opportunity and responsibility. Despite growth, life remained modest. There were no grand structures, no dramatic expansion. Progress arrived quietly, measured in seasons endured rather than buildings raised. As you imagine this phase, picture a settlement that feels settled but not crowded, people moving with purpose but without haste, smoke rising from multiple hearths at dusk, water reflecting fading light. This was the middle ground between frontier and city, a place learning its own rhythm, not yet formal but no longer fragile, not ambitious but no longer uncertain. And as time continued to flow gently forward, this growing settlement held steady, shaped by patience and routine, slowly preparing for a moment when structure would give way to recognition and the frontier post would begin to call itself something more permanent. As the years passed, the settlement by the water crossed a quiet threshold. It did not announce itself with ceremony or sudden ambition. Instead, it arrived at a new identity through repetition, memory, and the slow accumulation of daily life. What had once been a frontier post, tentative, modest, and flexible, now carried the weight of continuity. In the place that would become Chicago, permanence was no longer a question. It was an assumption that settled gently into every decision. The presence of people became steadier. Arrivals still came and went, but a core group remained through changing seasons. Faces became familiar not just from one year to the next, but from one winter to another. This continuity changed how people planned. Supplies were stored with confidence. Repairs were made with the expectation of long use. The future began to feel close enough to prepare for. Buildings reflected this shift. Structures were reinforced, aligned more carefully, and placed with awareness of neighbors and shared space. The settlement began to look inward as well as outward. Paths between buildings became clearer through repeated use. What had once been open ground slowly took on shape, defined not by lines on a map, but by habit and movement. Daily life developed a gentle structure. Work followed patterns that repeated reliably. Trade occurred at expected times. Tasks were divided naturally as people recognized one another's strengths. This organization was not imposed from above. It grew from necessity and familiarity, shaped by trust built over time. With routine came a sense of responsibility. People looked after shared resources. They noticed when something was missing or damaged. Cooperation was no longer just helpful, it was essential. The settlement depended on itself more than ever, even as connections to the outside world strengthened. The waterways continued to support this growth. Boats arrived carrying not only goods but expectations. Travelers recognized the settlement as a place of return. It became a point of reference, a location spoken of with recognition rather than description. This recognition marked a profound change. The place had entered memory beyond its immediate surroundings. Communication increased. Messages and news circulated more regularly. Information shaped decisions and planning. The settlement was no longer isolated in experience, even if distance still separated it from larger centers. Awareness expanded, bringing both opportunity and responsibility. As population increased slowly, the need for formal structure emerged, not out of ambition, but practicality. Disputes required resolution. Shared concerns required agreement. The community began to discuss rules and responsibilities more clearly. These discussions were calm and deliberate, guided by the desire to preserve stability rather than impose control. This movement toward incorporation was not dramatic. It unfolded through meetings, conversations, and consensus. The idea of defining the settlement officially felt like a natural step rather than a leap. It acknowledged what already existed rather than creating something new. The land continued to influence boundaries and growth. Wet ground limited expansion, flooding dictated where permanence was possible. The settlement grew where the land allowed it, not where ambition alone desired it. This restraint preserved balance, even as structure increased. Sound within the settlement changed again. Human activity filled more of the day. Conversations overlapped. Work created rhythm. Yet silence still returned at night, unbroken and complete. Darkness remained deep. Rest came naturally, guided by the absence of constant stimulation. Time felt layered now. The past was remembered through shared stories. The present unfolded through routine. The future was imagined cautiously, without urgency. Life moved forward without haste, confident in its own pace. The act of incorporation marked recognition rather than transformation. It placed a name and boundary around a reality that had already taken shape. The settlement became a city in definition, though its spirit remained grounded and calm. This new identity did not erase the frontier. It absorbed it. Flexibility remained. Adaptation continued. Growth was still careful. The city carried its early lessons forward, shaped by land, water, and patience. As you imagine this moment, picture a settlement at dusk. Lamps glowing softly. People finishing daily tasks. Paths worn smooth by familiarity. The vast landscape still visible beyond the edges, reminding everyone of where they began. This was the quiet birth of a city, not through ambition, but through belonging. Not through speed, but through steadiness. A place that learned how to remain. A community that chose continuity. And as time continued its slow, even movement, This incorporated city held its shape gently, ready, without urgency, to grow further, guided by the same calm rhythm that had carried it from open land to shared home. Number 4. Canals, railroads, and economic expansion. As the newly incorporated city began to settle into its identity, a different kind of movement quietly took hold. This movement was not defined by footsteps or canoes alone, but by ideas. Ideas about connection, trade, and the reshaping of distance. In Chicago, the natural meeting of water and land inspired a new vision, that this place could become a true center of exchange, linking regions far beyond what the eye could see. The early years of expansion did not arrive with urgency. Instead, they unfolded through careful planning and repeated effort. The land still demanded respect. Wet ground, shifting water levels, and long winters continued to shape every decision. Yet the idea of improving movement through this space grew stronger with each passing season. Waterways remained the city's earliest advantage. Rivers that had once guided small boats now carried greater purpose. The concept of a canal emerged slowly, not as a sudden invention, but as an extension of existing knowledge. If water already connected regions naturally, perhaps it could be guided just a little more deliberately. The work of building canals required patience. Earth was moved by hand, water levels were measured and adjusted carefully. Progress was slow, often interrupted by weather and seasonal change, yet each small advance brought new possibility. Where movement had once paused, it could now continue. Where goods had once been carried over land with difficulty, they could now float gently onward. As canals began to function, trade expanded quietly. Goods arrived from inland regions and departed toward distant markets. The city felt busier, though not louder. Activity increased, but it remained purposeful rather than chaotic. People learned to coordinate their work, aligning schedules with water levels and seasons. The presence of canals altered daily life subtly. Storage became more important. Warehouses appeared near water routes, built simply but sturdily. These structures did not seek attention. They existed to hold and protect, reflecting the city's growing role as a place of exchange rather than consumption. With increased trade came increased awareness. News traveled alongside goods, ideas moved as easily as materials. The city felt more connected, less isolated, yet even as activity grew, the pace remained measured. Growth followed opportunity, not speculation. Soon, another form of movement began to shape the city's future: railroads. At first, they seemed uncertain, almost experimental. Steel tracks cut through land that had long resisted straight lines. The idea of fixed routes felt unfamiliar in a place shaped by water and flexibility. Railroad construction was demanding. Ground had to be leveled. Paths had to be chosen carefully. Weather delayed progress. Yet the promise of reliability pushed work forward. Unlike waterways, railroads were not bound by seasons in the same way. They offered consistency, a new kind of certainty. As tracks extended outward, the city's role expanded again. Trains arrived carrying goods, people, and possibility. Departure times were scheduled. Arrival was expected. This predictability reshaped how people thought about time and distance. Journeys that once required weeks could now be measured in days. The presence of railroads changed the city's soundscape. The quiet rhythm of water was joined by the steady clatter of wheels and distant whistles. These sounds did not overwhelm the city, but they marked a shift. Movement was becoming constant. Economic life grew more complex. Markets expanded, prices stabilized, specialization increased. People focused on particular trades, trusting that the broader system would support them. This trust was built slowly, reinforced by repeated success rather than sudden wealth. Neighborhoods began to form around these routes of movement. Workers settled near canals and rail lines, valuing proximity over comfort. Homes were modest, built for function rather than display. Life followed the rhythm of work and rest, shaped by schedules that aligned with transport. Despite expansion, the city did not lose its sense of restraint. Growth was steady rather than explosive. the land still imposed limits. Floods reminded everyone of water's power. Harsh winters tested infrastructure. Each challenge reinforced the need for careful planning. The relationship between the city and its surroundings deepened. Farmers relied on canals and railroads to send goods outward. In return, supplies flowed inward. This exchange strengthened regional ties, making the city a true hub rather than an isolated point. Even as trade increased, life retained a sense of calm. Days were full, but not frantic. Evenings returned to quiet. Lamps lit gradually. Conversations softened. Sleep came naturally after long, purposeful work. The city's identity shifted gently. It was no longer just a place to pass through or settle cautiously. It became a place of connection, a place where movement paused just long enough to change direction. As you imagine this chapter, picture water reflecting warehouse walls at dusk, trains moving steadily through open land, workers finishing their tasks without haste. The city alive but composed. This era did not announce greatness. It built it slowly, through canals dug patiently, through rails laid carefully, and as the city continued to expand, guided by water and steel, it did so without losing its balance, growing not by rushing forward but by extending its reach gently, one connection at a time. As canals and railroads became a steady presence in the growing city, their influence moved beyond infrastructure and began to shape the rhythm of everyday life. What had once been an idea about connection now became a lived experience. In Chicago, movement was no longer occasional or uncertain. It was expected. Goods arrived, departed, and returned again, creating a steady pulse that quietly transformed how the city understood itself. The canal system, once a difficult experiment, settled into routine use. Water flowed predictably, carrying cargo that linked distant farms, towns, and markets. Barges moved slowly, guided by human hands and patient planning. Their pace was unhurried, almost meditative. Watching them pass became a familiar sight, part of the city's visual language. Warehouses expanded along these waterways, growing in number and capacity. They were built with practicality in mind, designed to protect goods from weather and time. Inside, workers moved steadily, lifting, sorting, and storing with practiced ease. The work was repetitive but grounding, creating a sense of order in a world that had once felt uncertain. Railroads, too, settled into reliability. Tracks that once seemed foreign now felt permanent. Trains arrived at expected hours, their schedules shaping daily routines. People adjusted their lives around these movements. Time became more structured, divided into predictable intervals. This structure brought a quiet comfort, even as it demanded discipline. The city's economy expanded in layers. Trade no longer depended on a single resource or route. Diversity brought resilience. When waterways slowed, railroads continued. When weather disrupted land routes, water offered alternatives. This flexibility strengthened confidence, allowing businesses to plan beyond immediate survival. Markets grew more complex. Goods arrived from far regions, introducing variety and consistency. Prices stabilized. Availability increased. Daily life felt more secure. People trusted that supplies would arrive, that work would continue, that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to plan for it. Employment diversified as well. Some worked directly with transport, loading, unloading, maintaining. Others focused on processing goods, turning raw materials into usable products. Still others managed records, schedules, and coordination. This variety allowed people to find roles suited to their skills, reducing uncertainty. Neighborhoods continued to form near these centers of movement. Life in these areas followed a steady rhythm. Mornings began early. Work filled the day. Evenings brought rest. Homes were simple but purposeful, offering shelter and routine rather than luxury. The soundscape of the city evolved gently. The soft movement of water blended with the steady noise of trains and human activity. These sounds became familiar, even comforting. Silence still existed, especially at night, but it was no longer absolute. Instead, It was layered with distant reminders of connection. The city's relationship with its surroundings deepened further. Farmers relied on these transport networks to send produce outward. In return, manufactured goods and supplies flowed inward. This exchange created interdependence, tying rural and urban life together in a shared rhythm. Growth did not erase challenges. Infrastructure required constant maintenance. Flooding tested canals. Weather disrupted rail lines. Each obstacle demanded attention and adaptation. The city learned through experience, improving systems gradually rather than expecting perfection. Economic confidence grew slowly, not through sudden wealth, but through consistency. Businesses expanded cautiously. Investments were measured. People valued reliability over risk. This mindset shaped the city's character, encouraging steady progress rather than dramatic leaps. Social life adjusted to this new rhythm. People gathered after work, sharing stories shaped by routine rather than adventure. Community formed through shared schedules and repeated encounters. Familiar faces became anchors in a changing environment. Time felt different now. Days moved steadily, marked by predictable events. Weeks blended smoothly. Seasons still mattered, but their impact softened. The city felt less vulnerable to natural fluctuation, though never entirely free from it. The canals and railroads did more than move goods. They carried ideas, habits, and expectations. They taught the city how to coordinate, how to wait, how to rely on systems larger than any individual. This lesson settled deeply, shaping future decisions. As you imagine this phase, picture long lines of rail stretching into the distance, barges moving calmly through water, workers pausing briefly at sunset, satisfied with completed tasks, the city alive with motion, yet never hurried. This was expansion through repetition, growth through reliability. The city did not rush forward. It moved steadily, guided by water and steel. And as these systems continued to operate day after day, they wove themselves into the city's identity, turning Chicago into not just a place of passage, but a place of sustained connection, calm, dependable, and quietly powerful. As the systems of canals and railroads continued to operate day after day, their presence settled so deeply into the life of the city that it began to feel natural, almost invisible. What once required planning and debate now unfolded through routine. In Chicago, movement became a background rhythm, steady and dependable, shaping thought and behavior without demanding attention. The city learned to trust its connections. Barges arrived with familiar regularity, their slow passage through water offering a sense of calm continuity. Trains followed schedules that rarely surprised. This reliability changed how people imagined the future. Planning extended beyond the next season. Decisions were made with confidence that systems would hold. Economic life expanded not through spectacle, but through layering. One activity supported another. Storage led to processing. Processing led to distribution. Distribution encouraged specialization. Each role depended on others quietly, forming a network that felt resilient because it was interwoven rather than centralized. The presence of canals continued to influence the city's physical shape. Areas near water grew busier, yet never chaotic. Paths formed through repeated use. Buildings clustered where access mattered most. Quiet coordination, not leisure or display. Railroads extended this influence outward. Tracks connected the city to distant regions, but they also organized space within it. Neighborhoods aligned themselves along lines of movement. People chose where to live based on access and routine rather than novelty. This practical decision-making reinforced stability. Daily life adapted smoothly. Mornings began with familiar sounds. Work followed predictable patterns. Evenings returned with expected quiet. This repetition reduced uncertainty and allowed people to focus on small improvements rather than constant adaptation. The city's workforce became increasingly skilled. Experience accumulated through repetition. Tasks were refined. Efficiency improved not through speed, but through familiarity. Pride developed around reliability and competence rather than risk. Markets matured. Instead of reacting to shortages or excess, they adjusted gradually. Prices reflected steady flow rather than sudden change. This stability encouraged moderation, discouraging extremes. Economic life felt balanced, grounded in reality rather than speculation. The surrounding region grew more closely tied to the city. Farmers, producers, and small towns adjusted their rhythms to match transport schedules. The city became a reference point for timing and exchange. Its influence extended gently, without force. Challenges continued to appear, but they were met with experience rather than alarm. Floods required repair, weather delayed movement, equipment needed maintenance. These tasks became part of routine rather than crisis. The city learned resilience through repetition. Social structures reflected this maturity. Community ties strengthened through shared work and shared schedules. People recognized one another not through novelty, but through presence. Familiarity bred trust. Trust supported cooperation. Time itself felt organized. Days moved predictably, weeks flowed evenly. Seasons still mattered, but their impact was softened by infrastructure and planning. Life felt less fragile, more composed. The city's identity shifted quietly. It was no longer defined by possibility alone, but by function. It worked, it connected, it sustained. This identity carried confidence without noise. As you imagine this final phase of expansion, picture the city at dusk. Trains slowing as evening approaches, water reflecting steady lights, workers heading home without haste. The systems continuing, even as people rest. This was growth without urgency, expansion without spectacle. The city did not rush toward greatness, it settled into it slowly. Canals and railroads did more than move goods. They taught patience, they taught coordination, and as Chicago continued to grow, it did so with a calm assurance, carried forward by steady movement, quiet labor, and the understanding that true strength often arrives not through sudden change, but through the gentle accumulation of reliable days. Number 5. Immigration and the rise of an industrial metropolis as canals and railroads settled into dependable rhythms. The city entered another quiet transformation, one shaped not by steel or water alone, but by people. Movement now arrived in the form of families, individuals, and communities drawn by the promise of steady work and a place to belong. In Chicago, this arrival did not feel sudden or overwhelming at first. It unfolded gradually, one household at a time, carried by hope and necessity rather than spectacle. People came from many places, each bringing their own habits, languages, and ways of understanding the world. They arrived with modest expectations, often seeking stability more than fortune. The city, with its expanding industries and reliable transport, offered work that was demanding but consistent. This consistency mattered. It allowed people to plan, to settle, to imagine a future measured in years rather than days. Factories and workshops grew steadily along transport routes. These buildings were practical, built to function rather than impress. Inside, machines hummed with steady repetition. Work followed patterns that repeated hour after hour, day after day. The sound of industry became part of the city's background, constant, grounding, and predictable. For newcomers, industrial work offered structure. Shifts began and ended at set times. Tasks were clearly defined. Though the work could be exhausting, it brought a sense of order. After long days, evenings felt earned. Rest carried weight. Sleep arrived with the comfort of routine. Neighborhoods formed naturally around places of employment. People chose to live close to work, valuing time and energy over distance. Streets filled with modest homes, shared walls, and familiar faces. These neighborhoods developed identities shaped by daily life rather than formal design. Shops appeared where needs arose. Schools followed families. Places of gathering emerged quietly. Daily life in these communities followed a steady rhythm. Mornings began early. Meals were simple and nourishing. Work filled most of the day. Evenings brought shared spaces, kitchens, doorways, sidewalks, where conversation flowed gently. Familiar voices replaced unfamiliar ones. Belonging grew through repetition. Cultural traditions remained important. People carried songs, recipes, and stories with them, preserving memory while adapting to new surroundings. These traditions did not separate communities, they layered the city's identity, adding depth without disruption. Difference existed alongside cooperation. Industrial growth expanded opportunities beyond factory floors. Support roles developed: maintenance, transport, administration, trade. This variety allowed families to imagine progression. Not dramatic, but gradual. Experience mattered. Reliability was valued. Stability became achievable. The city's pace adjusted to this influx. Activity increased, yet it remained orderly. Streets grew busier during daylight, then returned to calm at night. The hum of industry softened after shifts ended. Lamps lit gradually. The city rested collectively. Challenges existed, but they were faced within a framework of routine. Work was demanding. Living conditions were modest, yet predictability provided resilience. Communities supported one another quietly, sharing resources, information, and care. The city's identity evolved through this period. It became less defined by infrastructure alone and more by the lives woven through it. Industry provided structure, but people gave meaning. The metropolis grew not through ambition, but through accumulation of days worked, meals shared, routines repeated. As you imagine this chapter, picture long factory windows glowing at dusk, workers walking home together, neighborhood streets settling into evening calm. The city alive, not with noise, but with presence. This was the rise of an industrial metropolis shaped by human rhythm, not hurried, not chaotic. A city growing through routine, community, and the quiet strength of people choosing to stay, to work, and to rest together, day after steady day. As the flow of people into the city continued, the character of Chicago began to deepen in quiet, lasting ways. What had started as individual journeys slowly became shared experience. Streets that once felt unfamiliar grew recognizable. Faces once unknown became neighbors. The city did not change overnight, but it absorbed each arrival patiently, allowing new lives to settle into its steady rhythm. Industrial work continued to shape daily existence. Factories opened early and closed late, their schedules structuring time for thousands of workers. Inside, repetition defined the hours. Machines moved with dependable precision. Hands learned tasks through practice rather than instruction. The body adapted to routine, finding strength in familiarity. Though the work was demanding, it offered something deeply valued: certainty. This certainty reshaped how people thought about life. Planning became possible. Families organized their days around shifts and rest. Meals followed predictable times. Sleep arrived more reliably, guided by physical effort and routine rather than anxiety. The city taught its residents how to live within structure, and many found comfort in that structure. Neighborhoods grew denser but also more connected. Homes stood close together, sharing walls, sounds, and warmth. Children played in familiar streets. Adults exchanged brief conversations during daily routines. Community developed through proximity and repetition rather than formal organization. Languages mixed in the air, carried softly through doorways and windows. Differences existed, but they did not dominate. Shared work and shared schedules created common ground. Cooperation mattered more than distinction. The city encouraged this blending quietly, through necessity rather than ideology. Shops emerged where needs concentrated. Bakeries, small markets, repair stores, all served daily life rather than ambition. These places became anchors, known and trusted. People returned to the same counters, greeted by familiar faces. Transactions carried relationship as much as exchange. Education began to find a stronger place in community life. Children attended schools regularly, learning discipline and routine early. These institutions reflected industrial values: punctuality, consistency, effort. Learning followed structure, preparing the next generation for predictable work and stable life. The city soundscape evolved gently. Daytime carried the steady noise of work and movement. Evenings softened into conversation and quiet activity. Nights brought rest, broken only by distant trains or late shifts. This pattern repeated, creating a sense of collective rhythm. Cultural life continued within this structure. Celebrations were modest, often centered around home and neighborhood. Traditions were maintained quietly, adapted to new surroundings. Music, food, and shared stories provided continuity, connecting past and present without resisting change. Economic opportunity expanded gradually. Some workers advanced into supervisory roles. Others opened small businesses. Progress existed, but it was incremental. The city rewarded patience and consistency more than risk. Stability remained the primary goal for most. Challenges persisted beneath the surface. Living spaces were often crowded. Work could be exhausting. Resources were limited. Yet communities responded through mutual support rather than complaint. People shared knowledge, assistance, and time. Survival became collective rather than individual. The city's infrastructure adjusted slowly. Streets improved, transport expanded, services grew to meet demand. These changes were practical rather than impressive. They aimed to support daily life rather than redefine it. Time passed differently now. Years blended together, marked by familiar milestones. Jobs kept, children grown, routines sustained. Memory formed around repetition rather than singular events. Life felt continuous. The city's identity as an industrial metropolis strengthened quietly. It was no longer simply a place of movement and exchange. It was a place where lives unfolded fully, shaped by work, rest, and community. As you imagine this deeper phase, picture rows of homes settling into night, lamps glowing softly, workers resting after long days, streets calm and familiar, the city breathing evenly. This was growth through endurance, through routine, through shared effort. An industrial metropolis not defined by speed or spectacle, but by the quiet accumulation of ordinary lives lived steadily day after day within a city that learned how to hold them gently. As years passed and generations grew within the same streets and neighborhoods, the industrial character of Chicago settled into something steady and enduring. What had once felt new and demanding slowly became familiar. Industry no longer announced itself loudly. It simply existed, woven into the background of daily life, shaping habits, expectations, and identity with quiet persistence. Families who had arrived seeking stability now found themselves rooted. Children who once watched their parents leave for factory shifts grew up to follow similar routines, though often with greater confidence and understanding. Work was no longer an unknown challenge. It was a known path, predictable and reliable. This familiarity softened hardship and created a sense of belonging that extended beyond individual households. The city's neighborhoods matured alongside their residents. Buildings aged, carrying marks of use rather than neglect. Streets became familiar routes walked daily without thought. Local shops remained steady, serving generations of the same families. These places held memory, not through monuments but through repetition. Industrial work continued to define the city's rhythm. Shifts began and ended with dependable regularity. Machines required maintenance, attention, and skill. Workers learned to listen to the sounds of equipment, recognizing when something needed adjustment. Pride developed around competence and reliability. Skill was measured not by speed but by consistency. The city's economy grew more complex yet remained grounded. Large factories operated alongside smaller workshops. Supporting industries expanded quietly. The flow of goods continued steadily, reinforcing the city's role as a central point of production and exchange. This economic web felt resilient because it was layered rather than singular. Social life adapted fully to this rhythm. Leisure existed, but it was structured around work. Weekends offered rest and simple pleasure. Community gatherings were modest, focused on familiarity rather than novelty. The city valued comfort over spectacle, routine over excitement. Cultural identity deepened through daily practice. Traditions were passed down naturally, adapted to new surroundings without losing meaning. Food, music, and shared stories remained important. offering continuity within change. These elements enriched the city quietly, adding warmth to industrial routine. Education continued to shape future generations. Schools reinforced discipline and structure while offering opportunity for advancement. Learning became a bridge between stability and possibility, allowing gradual movement beyond factory floors without disrupting community bonds. The city's infrastructure matured in response. Services improved. Transportation adjusted. Housing expanded carefully. These changes were rarely dramatic. They aimed to support daily life rather than transform it. Improvement arrived through maintenance and refinement rather than replacement. Time felt steady and predictable. Years passed without sudden shifts. Progress was measured through accumulation of experience, of relationships, of routine. Life felt continuous rather than fragmented. This continuity provided emotional grounding. Challenges still existed. Work remained demanding. Inequality persisted. Yet these realities were faced within a framework of support and familiarity. Communities responded through cooperation rather than upheaval. Resilience became habitual. The city's identity as an industrial metropolis reached maturity during this phase. It was no longer defined by growth alone, but by endurance. It had learned how to sustain itself, how to hold its people, how to move forward without losing balance. As you imagine this final phase of industrial rise, picture an evening settling across the city, factories quieting, streets easing into calm, homes glowing softly, families resting after predictable days. This was a city comfortable with itself, a place shaped by work but not consumed by it. Immigration and industry had done their work quietly, layering life upon life until the metropolis felt complete, not finished, but stable. And as night arrived, the city rested easily, carried by routine and familiarity, breathing slowly, ready to continue tomorrow just as it had today, steady, grounded, and quietly alive. Number 6, the Great Chicago Fire and Urban Reconstruction. As the city continued its steady rise as an industrial and immigrant metropolis, life in Chicago moved forward with a sense of routine and confidence. Streets were familiar. Work followed predictable hours. Neighborhoods felt rooted. There was little sense that anything could interrupt this steady rhythm. The city had learned how to endure daily challenges, and that endurance created a quiet belief in stability. Then, in a single stretch of time, that belief was tested. The fire did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, at a moment when most of the city was settling into night. Small flames met dry wood, and dry wood met wind. What followed was not instant destruction, but a rapid unfolding of events that moved faster than expectation. Much of the city had been built for speed rather than safety. Wood was abundant, affordable, and familiar. Homes, shops, warehouses, and even sidewalks shared the same material. It had supported fast growth, but it also carried hidden risk. When fire found it, the city's very structure became fuel. Wind moved steadily through streets and alleys, carrying embers from one building to the next. What began in one place spread outward, not violently at first, but persistently. People noticed smoke before flames. Confusion replaced routine. Familiar streets felt suddenly uncertain. As the fire grew, sound changed dramatically. The usual hum of industry disappeared, replaced by crackling, rushing air and urgent movement. Bells rang, voices called out, footsteps quickened. The city, once calm and predictable, entered a state of motion unlike anything it had known before. People responded instinctively. Families gathered what they could carry. Some paused to help neighbors. Others simply moved, guided by smoke and heat. Streets filled with quiet urgency rather than panic. The fire did not inspire chaos so much as disbelief. The scale of what was happening took time to register. Buildings that had stood for years fell within moments. Fire climbed walls and leapt across streets. The glow of flames turned night into an unnatural day. Familiar landmarks vanished into smoke and ash. The city's physical memory erased itself rapidly. Yet even in this moment there was restraint. People did not fight the fire with force. They moved away from it, recognizing its scale. The city, shaped by experience, understood when resistance was no longer possible. As the fire passed, it left behind silence. Not the comfortable silence of night, but a heavy stillness. Smoke lingered. Ash settled. The air felt different. What remained was space, wide, empty, and unfamiliar. The city awoke to a changed landscape. Streets ended abruptly. Neighborhoods were gone. What had once been dense and familiar now felt open and exposed. The scale of loss was difficult to comprehend, not because it was loud, but because it was so complete. Yet within this stillness, something else appeared. Movement returned, not frantic, but purposeful. People walked through familiar paths, now stripped of structure, orienting themselves through memory rather than sight. Conversations were quiet, measured. Shock softened into resolve. The fire had taken buildings, but it had not taken community. Neighbors recognized one another. Help moved through shared effort rather than instruction. Temporary shelters formed, food was shared, support appeared organically, shaped by the same cooperation that had once built the city. Rebuilding did not begin with ambition, it began with necessity. Shelter came first, then access, then stability. Decisions were made carefully, informed by loss rather than fear. The city did not rush to replace what had been destroyed. It paused, considered, and learned. Materials changed. Wood gave way gradually to brick and stone. Construction slowed but strengthened. Buildings rose with awareness of weight, spacing, and safety. The fire reshaped not only the city's appearance, but its thinking. Streets were reconsidered, infrastructure adjusted, planning became deliberate. The city's relationship with risk matured. What had once been accepted without question was now examined thoughtfully. Daily life resumed slowly. Work returned in fragments. Routines reformed, though altered. People adapted, drawing comfort from repetition even in changed surroundings. The city learned how to continue without pretending nothing had happened. The soundscape changed again. Construction replaced industry temporarily. Hammers echoed where machines once hummed. Progress was audible, but it was not rushed. Each new structure carried intention. Time passed, and the city rose again, not identical to before, but stronger in its awareness. The fire became part of collective memory, not as trauma alone, but as instruction. It taught restraint, planning, and resilience. As you imagine this chapter, picture early morning light over open ground, workers beginning again, smoke long gone but memory still present. The city quiet but not defeated. This was destruction without surrender, loss without collapse. The fire changed the city, but it did not end it. It refined it. And from that stillness, from that ash and space, Chicago began once more, carefully, deliberately, rebuilding itself into a place shaped not only by growth, but by understanding. After the fire passed and the city settled into its altered silence, a new phase of life began to unfold, slowly, carefully, and with deep awareness. In Chicago, rebuilding was not an act of erasing what had happened. It was an act of remembering while moving forward. The city did not rush to fill the empty spaces. It allowed time to shape decisions, understanding that haste had once come with hidden cost. The first days after the fire were marked by quiet organization. People moved through the open land with familiarity, orienting themselves by memory rather than structure. Streets were remembered even when they were no longer visible. Corners existed without buildings. Paths continued where walls had once stood. The city lived briefly as an outline of itself. Shelter became the most immediate concern. Temporary structures appeared, simple, practical, designed for protection rather than permanence. These early efforts reflected humility. No one attempted to rebuild the city all at once. Instead, people focused on warmth, rest, and safety. Stability began with the basics. Food and supplies followed. Distribution happened through cooperation rather than command. Communities that had once lived side by side now relied on one another more directly. Sharing became routine. Assistance moved quietly through familiar relationships. The city held itself together through recognition and trust. As days passed, attention shifted from survival to planning. Conversations turned thoughtful. People discussed what had failed and why. The fire was not treated as an accident alone, but as a lesson. There was a shared understanding that rebuilding offered a chance not just to replace, but to improve. Materials were reconsidered carefully. Wood, once the symbol of quick growth, was no longer trusted in the same way. Brick, stone, and metal began to take its place. These materials required more effort, more time, and more coordination. Yet they offered something the city now valued deeply: durability. Construction slowed, but it became intentional. Foundations were laid with care, walls rose steadily, spacing between buildings increased, streets widened where possible. These changes did not happen through sweeping declarations. They emerged through repeated choices, shaped by experience. The sound of rebuilding filled the air gently, hammering echoed across open spaces. Tools replaced machines temporarily. This sound was not frantic. It carried rhythm and patience. Each strike felt purposeful, contributing to something meant to last. Work routines reformed gradually. Industries returned in stages, adapting to new conditions. Some relocated temporarily, others rebuilt entirely. Employment resumed cautiously, allowing people to return to familiar patterns without overwhelming strain. The city's economy recovered through consistency rather than surge. Trade resumed, transport networks reconnected, canals and railroads once again carried goods and people, supporting recovery through movement. The city's role as a connector proved essential during this phase. Neighborhoods re-emerged, though altered. Familiar communities regrouped, sometimes in new arrangements. Streets that once defined boundaries shifted slightly. Yet social bonds remained intact. People recognized one another not by address, but by shared memory. Public spaces gained renewed importance. Open areas provided room for gathering, planning, and reflection. These spaces allowed the city to breathe, offering relief from density and a reminder of what had been lost and learned. Governance evolved quietly. Rules and standards developed to support safer construction. These measures were practical, not restrictive. They aimed to protect rather than control. The city's approach reflected maturity, an understanding that freedom and structure could coexist. Time moved differently during this period. Progress felt slower, but it was deeper. Each building raised carried intention. Each street restored reflected awareness. The city learned to value patience over speed. Daily life adjusted smoothly. People adapted to temporary conditions without complaint. Routines reformed around new environments. Children played among construction sites. Adults returned to work amid change. Life continued, grounded in repetition. Memory of the fire remained present, but it softened over time. It became part of the city's story rather than its identity. The event was remembered not with fear, but with respect. It informed choices without dominating them. As months turned into years, the city's shape grew clearer. Structures stood taller and stronger. Streets felt more open. The skyline began to form, not dramatically, but steadily. The city did not seek to replicate what had been lost. It allowed itself to become something slightly different. This reconstruction period reshaped confidence. People trusted the city again, not because it promised safety without risk, but because it demonstrated learning. Resilience became a shared belief, reinforced by visible progress. The relationship between people and place deepened. The city felt earned rather than assumed. Its strength came from experience, not optimism alone. This grounding influenced future growth, encouraging thoughtful expansion. As you imagine this phase, picture early mornings filled with soft construction sounds. See walls rising slowly. Feel the calm determination of people returning to routine. The city not yet complete, but clearly becoming. This was rebuilding without denial, progress without forgetting. The fire had cleared space not only on the land, but in thinking. And in that space, Chicago rebuilt itself patiently, layer by layer, guided by memory, cooperation, and the quiet decision to move forward with care. As reconstruction continued, and the memory of the fire softened into something quieter and more reflective. Chicago entered a stage of rebuilding that felt confident without being rushed. The urgency of immediate survival had passed. In its place came steadiness, a patient commitment to doing things carefully, thoughtfully, and with an eye toward endurance rather than speed. New buildings rose slowly across the city, each one shaped by lessons learned. Brick and stone replaced much of what had once been wood. Walls felt heavier, more grounded. Foundations were laid deeper, as if the city itself wanted to feel secure against the earth. Spacing between structures allowed light and air to move more freely, softening the sense of density that had once defined many neighborhoods. The skyline began to change in subtle ways. Height increased cautiously. Engineers and builders experimented carefully, testing ideas rather than announcing them. Each success encouraged the next, but restraint remained a guiding principle. Nothing was done all at once. The city allowed confidence to grow naturally through repetition and proof. Daily life adjusted seamlessly to the new environment. Streets reopened, sometimes wider than before. Paths felt familiar yet refreshed. People returned to routines that had been interrupted, finding comfort in the predictability of work, meals, and rest. The city's rhythm re-established itself, not identical to the past, but steadier. Commerce resumed fully during this phase. Shops reopened with renewed purpose. Markets regained their steady flow. The movement of goods through canals and railroads supported the city's recovery quietly, just as it had supported its growth before the fire. Reliability returned, reinforcing trust in the city's systems. Employment stabilized. Construction provided work, but so did the revival of industry. Factories reopened in safer structures. Workspaces felt more deliberate, designed with awareness of space and safety. This care did not remove hardship, but it reduced uncertainty. People felt that effort led somewhere solid. Neighborhoods settled into their renewed forms. Some streets shifted slightly. Some communities reorganized. Yet the social fabric remained intact. Familiar faces returned to familiar roles. Trust rebuilt alongside walls and roads, reinforced by shared memory of loss and recovery. Public life regained its calm presence. Gatherings returned, modest and familiar. Conversations reflected reflection rather than alarm. The fire became something people remembered together, not something they feared constantly. It was discussed with respect, then allowed to rest. Governance and planning matured further. Standards for building and safety became part of normal practice. These guidelines were accepted not as burdens but as shared protections. The city's collective mindset had changed. Risk was acknowledged. Preparation was valued. Time passed with reassuring regularity. Days followed one another evenly. Progress could be seen, but it did not demand attention. The city no longer felt fragile. It felt aware, alert without anxiety. The emotional tone of the city shifted gently. Where there had been shock, there was now confidence. Where there had been urgency, there was now patience. People trusted the rebuilt city, not because it promised perfection, but because it demonstrated learning. The relationship between the city and its inhabitants deepened. Living here felt intentional. The place carried meaning beyond convenience or opportunity. It represented resilience earned through experience. This connection shaped how people cared for their surroundings and for one another. The rebuilt city carried forward the lessons of restraint and cooperation. Growth continued, but it was guided. Expansion respected limits. Ambition remained present, but it was grounded. The fire had refined the city's character, giving it clarity. As you imagine this final phase of reconstruction, picture a calm evening settling over solid streets. Buildings standing quietly, lights glowing warmly through windows. The city at rest, confident in its foundations. This was recovery without haste, strength without noise. The fire had tested the city's limits and revealed its capacity to learn. And in that learning, Chicago found a deeper form of stability, one built not just from brick and stone, but from memory, patience, and the quiet resolve to continue carefully into whatever future awaited. Number 7, Chicago in the early 20th century. As the city moved beyond reconstruction and into a new century, Life in Chicago took on a different texture, less focused on survival or repair, and more on rhythm, confidence, and everyday continuity. The early years of the 20th century did not arrive with a single defining moment. They settled in gradually, like a calm morning after a long night, bringing with them a sense that the city had finally learned how to live within its own strength. The rebuilt streets felt solid beneath foot and wheel. Buildings stood with quiet assurance, their materials chosen carefully, their placement considered. The memory of loss still existed, but it no longer shaped every thought. Instead, people moved forward with an awareness that felt balanced, alert, but not anxious. The city had endured enough to trust itself again. Daily life followed steady patterns. Work began early and ended predictably. Factories operated with measured consistency. Offices and shops opened their doors each morning without fanfare. The city functioned smoothly, not because it was perfect, but because it had learned the value of routine. Familiarity replaced uncertainty. Transportation continued to define the city's movement, though now it felt integrated rather than disruptive. Trains arrived and departed on schedule. Streetcars moved steadily through neighborhoods, connecting homes to workplaces. Travel felt accessible, reliable, and ordinary. Distance shrank quietly, not through speed alone, but through expectation. Neighborhoods deepened in character during this period. Streets were no longer simply places to pass through. They were lived-in spaces shaped by repeated presence. Children walked familiar routes to school. Neighbors recognized one another by habit rather than introduction. Community existed without formal declaration. Homes reflected this stability. Interiors were arranged for comfort rather than necessity alone. Evenings became spaces for rest rather than recovery. Meals were shared at regular times. Conversation unfolded slowly. Sleep arrived without urgency, guided by routine and familiarity. Cultural life expanded gently. Music, performance, and shared gatherings became more visible parts of daily experience. These were not distractions from work, but complements to it. They offered reflection, enjoyment, and connection without overwhelming the city's calm pace. Architecture continued to evolve thoughtfully. New buildings rose with attention to light, space, and function. Height increased cautiously. Innovation occurred, but it was tested carefully. The skyline grew not through sudden ambition, but through steady experimentation. Public spaces gained renewed importance. Parks, walkways, and gathering areas offered relief from density. These spaces invited pause. People sat, walked, and observed without purpose beyond presence. The city understood the value of stillness alongside movement. Work remained central to identity, but it no longer consumed it entirely. Leisure found space within routine. Weekends brought modest rest. Recreation followed predictable patterns. Balance became an unspoken goal. The city's population felt settled. Many families had lived in the same neighborhoods for years. Memory layered itself into place. Streets carried stories not through monuments, but through familiarity. Time felt cumulative rather than fleeting. Sound softened during this era. The city remained active, but noise felt organized. Industry hummed rather than roared. Evenings returned to quiet predictably. Night brought rest without interruption. The city slept collectively. Economic life felt stable. Growth continued, but it was measured. Businesses planned cautiously. Employment felt reliable. This predictability reduced anxiety and encouraged long-term thinking. People imagined futures that extended beyond immediate need. Education and learning continued quietly. Schools reinforced discipline and routine. Knowledge passed from generation to generation without disruption. The city invested in continuity rather than reinvention. The relationship between people and the city matured. Living here felt intentional. The place no longer needed to prove itself. It existed comfortably within its own identity. As you imagine this period, picture early morning light on solid streets, people beginning their day without haste, the city breathing evenly. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just life unfolding as expected. This was Chicago at ease with itself, a city no longer reacting but living. The early 20th century did not transform the city, it confirmed it. It allowed the city to settle into the strength it had earned, moving forward calmly, confidently, and without hurry, guided by routine, memory, and the quiet assurance that it knew how to continue. As the early 20th century continued to unfold, life in Chicago deepened into a calm sense of familiarity. The city no longer felt like a place constantly becoming something else. It felt like a place that had arrived, settled into its own rhythm, and learned how to carry itself through time without urgency. Change still occurred, but it arrived quietly, layered gently on top of what already existed. Morning routines repeated themselves across neighborhoods with comforting regularity. Streets awakened slowly. Doors opened, footsteps followed familiar paths. Public transportation moved steadily, carrying people who knew exactly where they were going. There was little confusion, little hesitation. The city moved as if guided by shared understanding rather than instruction. Workplaces reflected this maturity. Factories, offices, and shops operated with dependable structure. Tasks were known, roles were understood. Experience mattered more than speed. People took pride in doing things well rather than quickly. This focus created stability, allowing effort to feel meaningful without being exhausting. The pace of the city remained balanced. It was active, but not frantic. Busy, but not overwhelming. Even in its most crowded areas, movement felt organized. Crowds flowed rather than pressed. Sound layered itself naturally. Conversation, transport, distant industry, never fully overwhelming silence, especially in the early morning and late evening. Homes became centers of rest rather than mere shelter. Interiors reflected comfort and routine. Furniture was arranged with intention. Evenings followed familiar patterns. Meals were shared. Conversations unfolded without haste. After long days, rest came easily, supported by predictability and physical rhythm. Neighborhoods grew more distinct in personality. Each carried subtle differences shaped by daily life, work patterns, and shared experience. Yet these differences did not divide the city. They added texture. Movement between areas felt natural, supported by reliable transport and shared schedules. Public spaces continued to offer quiet balance. Parks and walkways provided relief from structured routines. People visited them without urgency, often simply to pause. These spaces encouraged observation rather than activity, allowing the city to breathe. Cultural expression expanded gently. Music, performance, and art existed alongside daily routine rather than competing with it. These expressions were woven into evenings and weekends, offering reflection rather than escape. Creativity felt accessible, familiar, and grounding. Architecture reflected thoughtful confidence. Buildings rose with attention to function, light, and space. Innovation occurred carefully, tested rather than declared. Height increased gradually. Each new structure felt like a conversation with those around it rather than a challenge to them. Transportation systems worked quietly in the background. Trains arrived on time. Streetcars followed predictable routes. Walking remained common. Movement felt effortless because it was expected. Distance no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a manageable part of daily life. Economic activity remained steady. Markets functioned reliably. Employment felt secure for many. Planning extended beyond immediate needs. People imagined futures measured in years rather than seasons. This sense of continuity reduced anxiety and encouraged patience. Education and learning became increasingly integrated into daily life. Schools operated regularly, reinforcing structure and discipline. Learning followed routine rather than urgency. Knowledge passed calmly between generations, supporting stability. Social life reflected moderation. Gatherings were modest. Celebrations were familiar. Community bonds strengthened through repetition rather than spectacle. People recognized one another through daily encounters rather than formal introductions. Time itself felt even. Days moved predictably. Weeks blended together smoothly. Seasons still marked change, but their impact was softened by infrastructure and planning. Life felt continuous rather than interrupted. The city's soundscape softened further. Activity remained present, but it was organized. Noise followed schedules. Night returned with reliable quiet. Sleep arrived naturally, guided by routine rather than exhaustion alone. The relationship between people and place matured fully during this period. The city was no longer a challenge to overcome or an opportunity to seize. It was a home. Living here felt natural, expected, and grounded. As you imagine this deeper phase of the early 20th century, picture a city moving calmly through a familiar day, streets active but composed, people purposeful but unhurried, evening settling gently over neighborhoods. This was Chicago living comfortably within itself, a city guided by rhythm rather than reaction. The early 20th century did not demand transformation, it allowed continuity, and within that continuity, the city found peace. Not the absence of movement, but the presence of balance, carrying itself forward quietly, confidently, and without rush into the unfolding years ahead. As the early 20th century moved toward its middle years, the sense of calm continuity in Chicago grew deeper and more assured. The city no longer felt defined by what it had survived or built. Instead, it felt defined by how it lived. Life unfolded with a quiet confidence that came from repetition, familiarity, and trust in systems that had proven themselves over time. Daily routines had become second nature. People no longer thought consciously about the structure of their days, it simply existed. Morning followed night, work followed morning, rest followed effort. This predictability created emotional ease. The city no longer asked its residents to adapt constantly, it allowed them to settle. Industry continued to operate steadily, but it no longer dominated imagination. Factories were part of the background now, like the river or the streets. Their presence was expected, reliable, and largely unnoticed unless absent. Work was important, but it was not the whole of life. People understood where effort ended and rest began. Transportation systems continued to function smoothly, reinforcing this sense of stability. Movement felt effortless because it was routine. People trusted that trains would arrive, that streetcars would follow their paths, that streets would lead where they always had. Distance felt manageable. The city felt navigable rather than overwhelming. Neighborhood life deepened further. Generations lived close to one another, sharing not just space but memory. Children grew up knowing the same streets their parents had walked. Familiar buildings carried layers of experience. Change happened slowly enough to feel natural rather than disruptive. Homes became increasingly personal. They reflected taste, habit, and comfort. Even modest spaces felt complete. Evenings were predictable and gentle. Lamps were lit. Meals were prepared. Conversations drifted without urgency. Sleep arrived as a natural conclusion rather than an escape. Cultural life continued quietly alongside routine. Entertainment did not seek to interrupt daily life but to accompany it. Music, stories, and shared experiences offered reflection rather than stimulation. These moments allowed people to pause without leaving the city's rhythm behind. Public life felt settled and composed. Parks, libraries, and shared spaces were used regularly but calmly. People visited them not to escape the city, but to exist within it more comfortably. These spaces provided balance, reminding residents that movement and stillness could coexist. Architecture continued to evolve, but cautiously. New ideas appeared, were tested, and then absorbed. The skyline grew with restraint. Buildings did not seek to dominate one another. They formed a conversation rather than a competition. The city valued harmony over spectacle. Economic life remained dependable. Markets adjusted smoothly. Employment felt steady. Planning extended naturally into the future. People trusted that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to prepare for it. This trust softened anxiety and encouraged patience. Education and learning remained integrated into daily life. Schools reinforced routine and continuity. Knowledge passed forward without urgency. Progress felt incremental rather than dramatic. Growth happened quietly. The city's soundscape reached a gentle balance. Activity filled daylight hours without overwhelming them. Evenings returned to calm reliably. Night brought rest. Silence was no longer complete, but it was comforting, layered with distant familiar sounds. Time itself felt generous. Days were full but not rushed. Years passed without feeling lost. Memory accumulated naturally. Life felt continuous, anchored in routine rather than punctuated by crisis. The city no longer felt like a project or an experiment. It felt lived in, understood, and accepted. People belonged not because they arrived, but because they stayed. This sense of belonging shaped how they moved, worked, and rested. As you imagine this final phase of the early 20th century, picture a quiet night across familiar neighborhoods, lights glowing softly, streets calm, the city breathing evenly, untroubled by urgency. This was Chicago at rest within its own rhythm, not still but balanced, not silent but calm. The early 20th century did not end with a transformation. It settled into continuity, and in that continuity, the city found a deep, enduring peace, one built not on excitement or ambition, but on the quiet confidence of a place that knew how to live, how to wait, and how to carry itself gently forward through time. Number 8. Depression, prohibition, and social transformation. As the steady rhythm of the early 20th century carried on, the city gradually entered a period where certainty softened and familiar patterns were tested. Life in Chicago did not stop, nor did it collapse. Instead, it slowed, tightened, and turned inward. This was a time when the city learned how to move carefully, conserving energy, attention, and hope, while still continuing forward. The transition was not abrupt. At first, daily routines held their shape. People still went to work, shops still opened, trains still ran. But beneath these visible motions, a quiet tension developed. Confidence that had once felt effortless now required intention. People noticed small changes. Work hours shortened, spending became cautious, conversations turned quieter. Economic pressure arrived gradually, like a long shadow stretching across familiar ground. Jobs that had once felt reliable became uncertain. Industries adjusted, reducing output without warning. Families learned to adapt, stretching resources carefully, sharing what they could, and relying more heavily on one another. Survival shifted from expansion to preservation. During this period, the idea of restraint entered daily life. Spending slowed, waste was avoided, objects were repaired rather than replaced. Even leisure became modest, shaped by familiarity rather than novelty. Comfort came from routine, not abundance. At the same time, another transformation unfolded quietly alongside economic strain. Prohibition altered social habits in subtle ways. Public behavior changed, but human need for connection remained. Gatherings moved inward, becoming smaller and more private. Conversation replaced spectacle. Social life adapted rather than disappeared. Neighborhoods became centers of resilience. People leaned into proximity and familiarity. Shared meals, quiet support, and informal cooperation became common. The city's strength during this time did not come from institutions alone, but from daily acts of endurance repeated across thousands of households. Work, when available, was valued deeply. Effort carried new weight. Those who remained employed worked with quiet gratitude, aware that certainty could not be assumed. Pride came not from progress, but from persistence. The city learned to respect effort in its simplest form. Public spaces reflected this shift. Activity remained present, but subdued. Parks and streets felt calmer, less hurried. Silence became more noticeable, not as absence, but as reflection. Even the city's soundscape softened. As movement slowed and urgency faded, time felt different now. Days stretched longer. Waiting became familiar. Plans were made cautiously. The future felt less defined but not hopeless. The city carried itself with patience, trusting that endurance would matter more than speed. Social transformation occurred quietly. Values shifted toward mutual support. Excess lost its appeal. Modesty gained respect. The city's identity adjusted gently, becoming less outward-facing and more inwardly grounded. As you imagine this chapter, picture early mornings with fewer footsteps, quieter streets, and careful movement. See people pausing before decisions, conserving energy. Feel the calm determination of a city choosing to endure rather than rush. This was not a collapse, it was a contraction. a period where the city held itself together by slowing down, by listening, and by relying on the quiet strength of routine and community. And as this era settled in, Chicago continued forward, not loudly, not confidently, but steadily, learning that survival sometimes means moving gently, conserving hope, and trusting that even the longest nights eventually give way to morning. As this quieter era deepened, life in Chicago continued to adjust in small, thoughtful ways. The city did not attempt to return immediately to the confidence it once knew. Instead, it accepted a slower pace, allowing new habits to form naturally. What emerged was not despair, but a careful kind of balance, one shaped by patience, restraint, and shared understanding. Days settled into gentler patterns. Mornings began without urgency. People moved with intention, conserving effort and attention. Work, when it came, was approached carefully. Tasks were done thoroughly, not quickly. There was a growing respect for steadiness, for showing up, for continuing even when reward felt distant. Households adapted quietly. Meals were planned with care. Ingredients were chosen for usefulness rather than variety. Cooking became an act of preservation and comfort. Familiar dishes returned again and again, offering reassurance through repetition. The table became a place of grounding, where conversation replaced uncertainty. Prohibition continued to shape social life in subtle ways. Public spaces grew quieter in the evenings, but private gatherings took on new importance. People met in smaller groups, sharing stories rather than spectacle. Social connection did not disappear. It simply softened, becoming more personal and less visible. Neighborhood bonds strengthened during this time. People relied on one another not through formal agreement but through familiarity, a borrowed tool, a shared meal, a quiet conversation on a doorstep. These small acts carried weight, reinforcing trust and resilience. Public life reflected this inward shift. Entertainment became modest. Leisure was shaped by routine rather than novelty. Parks and streets remained places of presence rather than activity. The city learned to appreciate stillness, finding meaning in calm rather than motion. Economic uncertainty continued, but it was met with adaptation rather than panic. People adjusted expectations. Ambitions were paused, not abandoned. The city learned how to wait without losing itself. Time became something to move through carefully rather than conquer. The city's soundscape softened further. Fewer crowds, slower movement, even industrial noise felt subdued. Silence returned in layers, not empty but reflective. Nights grew deeper, encouraging rest and inward thought. Social values shifted gently. Modesty became respected. Excess felt unnecessary. Effort and reliability gained quiet honor. The city's identity reshaped itself around endurance rather than expansion. As you imagine this phase, picture warm light in modest windows, conversation spoken softly, streets calm and familiar, the city resting without surrender. This was a time of quiet strength, of learning how to continue without certainty. And as this period carried on, Chicago remained itself, changed, slowed but intact, moving forward gently, trusting that patience, community, and routine would be enough to carry it through. As time continued to pass through this restrained and reflective era, life in Chicago settled into a quieter kind of endurance. The city no longer searched for quick recovery or dramatic change. Instead, it learned how to live within uncertainty, allowing patience to guide decisions and routine to provide comfort. What emerged was not a return to old confidence, but a new form of steadiness shaped by experience. People became deeply familiar with limitation. Rather than resisting it, they adapted gently. Days were organized carefully, effort was measured, nothing was wasted, not time, not resources, not attention. This careful way of living did not feel heavy. Over time, it became natural, even grounding. Work continued where possible, though often in reduced form. Those who worked did so with quiet focus, valuing consistency over advancement. Pride shifted away from progress and toward persistence. Simply continuing carried meaning. Showing up mattered more than moving ahead. Homes became spaces of refuge and rhythm. Daily routines repeated themselves with comforting predictability. The same meals appeared regularly. The same chairs were used each evening. The familiar arrangement of space provided reassurance in a world that felt less certain. These small consistencies carried emotional weight. Social life remained present but subdued. Conversations grew thoughtful. People listened more than they spoke. Silence became acceptable, even welcomed. Togetherness did not require activity. Presence was enough. The city learned that connection could exist without display. Prohibition continued to influence behavior quietly. Public life stayed restrained. Private life deepened. Trust mattered. Relationships were chosen carefully. Gatherings were small and intentional, shaped by familiarity rather than novelty. Neighborhoods functioned as anchors. People knew who lived nearby. Recognition replaced anonymity. Support moved through simple gestures, checking in, sharing, helping without being asked. These actions were not dramatic, but they sustained the city's emotional balance. Public spaces reflected calm restraint. Streets felt open and unhurried. Parks invited pause rather than activity. The city seemed to exhale, allowing itself to exist without pressure to perform. Time felt slower but not empty. Days were full of small, meaningful tasks. Progress was subtle, often invisible, yet continuity itself became proof of strength. The city remained present day after day without breaking its rhythm. Memory of better times did not disappear, but it softened. Hope did not vanish, it became quieter. Expectations adjusted. The future was imagined carefully, without urgency. Waiting became part of life, accepted rather than resisted. The city's identity shifted inward. It no longer defined itself by growth or ambition. It defined itself by survival, cooperation, and balance. These values reshaped how people related to one another and to the place they shared. As you imagine this final phase of the era, picture a city at night, streets calm, lights low, homes settled into rest, the sound of distant movement fading into silence. The city steady, not rushing toward tomorrow, but resting fully within today. This was endurance without drama, strength without noise. Depression and prohibition changed the city, not by breaking it, but by teaching it how to slow down, how to conserve, and how to continue gently. And as this chapter drew quietly to a close, Chicago remained patient, grounded, and intact, ready, without hurry, to step into whatever new rhythm the future would bring. Number 9, post-war Chicago and modern transformation. As the long period of restraint and quiet endurance began to ease, the city entered a new chapter shaped by gradual renewal rather than sudden change. Life in Chicago did not rush forward in response to relief or optimism. Instead, it unfolded carefully, as if the city wished to be certain before allowing itself to move at a different pace. The transition into the post-war era felt calm, measured, and thoughtful. Daily routines began to loosen slightly. Work became more available, and schedules regained consistency. People returned to familiar rhythms with renewed appreciation. Effort still mattered, but it was no longer weighed down by uncertainty. The city breathed a little more freely, though it did not forget the value of restraint. Neighborhoods felt steadier and more confident. Streets filled again with predictable movement. Homes that had once served as quiet shelters during difficult years now became places of gathering and comfort. Life expanded gently outward, without urgency or excess. Industry adjusted to new conditions. Factories continued to operate, but methods evolved quietly. Efficiency improved. Processes became smoother. Workspaces reflected learning rather than ambition. The city did not attempt to reinvent itself overnight. It refined what it already knew. Transportation systems expanded and adjusted to new patterns of life. Movement became easier and more reliable. Commutes felt manageable. Distance no longer carried the same weight it once had. This ease reshaped daily decisions, allowing people to imagine living and working in slightly different ways. Residential life began to shift subtly. Some families chose quieter areas while remaining connected to the city's rhythm. These changes did not fracture community, they extended it. The city learned how to spread without losing itself. Public life regained gentle energy. Streets felt alive again, though never chaotic. Shops reopened fully. Markets regained steady flow. Social interaction returned to public spaces shaped by familiarity rather than excitement. The city's soundscape changed slowly. Daytime activity increased. Evenings remained calm. Night brought reliable rest. The balance between movement and stillness remained intact, refined through experience. Architecture continued to evolve. New structures appeared alongside older ones, reflecting continuity rather than replacement. Design focused on function, comfort, and longevity. The city's skyline shifted gradually, respecting what already stood. Economic life stabilized further. Planning extended naturally into the future. Confidence returned, not as assumption but as earned trust. People believed in consistency more than promise. Education and learning continued to play a steady role. Schools reinforced routine while supporting adaptation. Knowledge moved forward quietly, shaping future generations without disruption. Time felt open again. Days were full but not heavy. Progress felt possible without feeling demanded. The city moved forward because it could, not because it had to. As you imagine this period, picture a city easing into a new rhythm. Streets active but calm. People moving with purpose but without pressure. Life resuming gently. This was renewal without urgency. Change without disruption. Post-war Chicago did not abandon its past. It carried it forward carefully, allowing modern life to emerge slowly, guided by memory, balance, and the quiet confidence of a city that had learned how to endure and how to continue. Architecture continued to evolve. New structures appeared alongside older ones, reflecting continuity rather than replacement. Design focused on function, comfort, and longevity. The city's skyline shifted gradually, respecting what already stood. Economic life stabilized further. Planning extended naturally into the future. Confidence returned not as assumption but as earned trust. People believed in consistency more than promise. Education and learning continued to play a steady role. Schools reinforced routine while supporting adaptation. Knowledge moved forward quietly, shaping future generations without disruption. Time felt open again. Days were full but not heavy. Progress felt possible without feeling demanded. The city moved forward because it could, not because it had to. As you imagine this period, picture a city easing into a new rhythm. Streets active but calm, people moving with purpose but without pressure. Life resuming gently. This was renewal without urgency, change without disruption. Post-war Chicago did not abandon its past. It carried it forward carefully, allowing modern life to emerge slowly, guided by memory, balance, and the quiet confidence of a city that had learned how to endure and how to continue. As the post-war years continued to unfold, the sense of renewal in Chicago became more deeply rooted in everyday life. The city did not surge forward in a burst of energy. Instead, it settled into a calm confidence, allowing change to arrive gradually and naturally. What defined this period was not speed, but steadiness, a feeling that life was moving forward without strain. Daily routines became more fluid. Work schedules felt reliable again, no longer interrupted by uncertainty. People moved through their days with quiet assurance, planning weeks and months ahead without hesitation. The future no longer felt distant or unclear. It felt reachable, shaped by ordinary effort and consistent rhythm. Neighborhood life continued to evolve gently. Streets felt fuller, yet still familiar. Children played without urgency. Adults returned home at predictable hours. Evenings unfolded calmly, shaped by shared meals, quiet conversation, and rest. The city regained its sense of balance, one household at a time. Industry adapted to modern demands with care. New methods appeared, but they did not erase what came before. Experience guided innovation. Factories and workplaces refined processes slowly, focusing on reliability rather than spectacle. Work felt purposeful, grounded in routine rather than ambition. Transportation became smoother and more integrated. Movement across the city felt easier, almost effortless. Travel was no longer something to plan carefully. It became part of daily life, supporting flexibility without disrupting routine. Distance felt smaller, less demanding. Public spaces reflected renewed comfort. Parks, streets, and gathering areas welcomed people back without pressure. Activity increased gently, never overwhelming. The city seemed to stretch, opening itself slightly wider while maintaining its calm center. Housing patterns adjusted quietly. Some areas grew denser, others grew quieter. These shifts happened without urgency or conflict. The city learned how to change shape while preserving continuity. Community remained intact even as patterns shifted. The city's soundscape softened into harmony. Daytime carried the steady noise of activity. Evenings returned to calm. Nights brought rest without interruption. The rhythm felt familiar, reassuring, and sustainable. Cultural life expanded modestly. Entertainment and shared experiences returned to public view, but they did not dominate daily life. They complemented it. Joy existed without excess. Celebration remained grounded. Economic confidence strengthened through repetition rather than promise. Stability was proven day by day. Planning became natural again. People trusted that effort would be met with continuity. This trust reduced anxiety and encouraged patience. Education continued to shape the city's future quietly. Schools reinforced structure while adapting to change. Learning moved forward steadily, preparing new generations for a city that valued balance over urgency. Time felt generous. Days moved evenly, weeks passed smoothly. Progress did not demand attention, it simply occurred. Life felt continuous rather than interrupted. The city's identity as a modern place took shape slowly. Modernity did not arrive as a break from the past, but as an extension of it. New ideas settled gently alongside established habits. The city remained itself while allowing itself to grow. As you imagine this phase, picture a city moving through an ordinary day with ease. Streets active but composed. People unhurried, the sense that everything is where it belongs. This was transformation without tension, modern life without loss of calm. Post-war Chicago did not redefine itself loudly. It refined itself quietly, allowing renewal to become routine and modern life to unfold naturally, supported by memory, balance, and the steady assurance that the city knew how to continue forward gently and without rush. Homes became spaces of refuge and rhythm. Daily routines repeated themselves with comforting predictability. The same meals appeared regularly. The same chairs were used each evening. The familiar arrangement of space provided reassurance in a world that felt less certain. These small consistencies carried emotional weight. Social life remained present but subdued. Conversations grew thoughtful. People listened more than they spoke. Silence became acceptable, even welcomed. Togetherness did not require activity. Presence was enough. The city learned that connection could exist without display. Prohibition continued to influence behavior quietly. Public life stayed restrained. Private life deepened. Trust mattered. Relationships were chosen carefully. Gatherings were small and intentional, shaped by familiarity rather than novelty. Neighborhoods functioned as anchors. People knew who lived nearby. Recognition replaced anonymity. Support moved through simple gestures, checking in, sharing, helping without being asked. These actions were not dramatic, but they sustained the city's emotional balance. Public spaces reflected calm restraint. Streets felt open and unhurried. Parks invited pause rather than activity. The city seemed to exhale, allowing itself to exist without pressure to perform. Time felt slower but not empty. Days were full of small, meaningful tasks. Progress was subtle, often invisible, yet continuity itself became proof of strength. The city remained present day after day without breaking its rhythm. Memory of better times did not disappear, but it softened. Hope did not vanish, it became quieter. Expectations adjusted. The future was imagined carefully, without urgency. Waiting became part of life, accepted rather than resisted. The city's identity shifted inward. It no longer defined itself by growth or ambition. It defined itself by survival, cooperation, and balance. These values reshaped how people related to one another and to the place they shared. As you imagine this final phase of the era, picture a city at night, streets calm, lights low, homes settled into rest, the sound of distant movement fading into silence. The city steady, not rushing toward tomorrow, but resting fully within today. This was endurance without drama, strength without noise. Depression and prohibition changed the city, not by breaking it, but by teaching it how to slow down, how to conserve, and how to continue gently. And as this chapter drew quietly to a close, Chicago remained patient, grounded, and intact, ready, without hurry, to step into whatever new rhythm the future would bring. Number 9, post-war Chicago and modern transformation. As the long period of restraint and quiet endurance began to ease, the city entered a new chapter shaped by gradual renewal rather than sudden change. Life in Chicago did not rush forward in response to relief or optimism. Instead, it unfolded carefully, as if the city wished to be certain before allowing itself to move at a different pace. The transition into the post-war era felt calm, measured, and thoughtful. Daily routines began to loosen slightly. Work became more available, and schedules regained consistency. People returned to familiar rhythms with renewed appreciation. Effort still mattered, but it was no longer weighed down by uncertainty. The city breathed a little more freely, though it did not forget the value of restraint. Neighborhoods felt steadier and more confident. Streets filled again with predictable movement. Homes that had once served as quiet shelters during difficult years now became places of gathering and comfort. Life expanded gently outward, without urgency or excess. Industry adjusted to new conditions. Factories continued to operate, but methods evolved quietly. Efficiency improved. Processes became smoother. Workspaces reflected learning rather than ambition. The city did not attempt to reinvent itself overnight. It refined what it already knew. Transportation systems expanded and adjusted to new patterns of life. Movement became easier and more reliable. Commutes felt manageable. Distance no longer carried the same weight it once had. This ease reshaped daily decisions, allowing people to imagine living and working in slightly different ways. Residential life began to shift subtly. Some families chose quieter areas while remaining connected to the city's rhythm. These changes did not fracture community, they extended it. The city learned how to spread without losing itself. Public life regained gentle energy. Streets felt alive again, though never chaotic. Shops reopened fully. Markets regained steady flow. Social interaction returned to public spaces shaped by familiarity rather than excitement. The city's soundscape changed slowly. Daytime activity increased. Evenings remained calm. Night brought reliable rest. The balance between movement and stillness remained intact, refined through experience. Architecture continued to evolve. New structures appeared alongside older ones, reflecting continuity rather than replacement. Design focused on function, comfort, and longevity. The city's skyline shifted gradually, respecting what already stood. Economic life stabilized further. Planning extended naturally into the future. Confidence returned, not as assumption, but as earned trust. People believed in consistency more than promise. Education and learning continued to play a steady role. Schools reinforced routine while supporting adaptation. Knowledge moved forward quietly, shaping future generations without disruption. Time felt open again. Days were full but not heavy. Progress felt possible without feeling demanded. The city moved forward because it could, not because it had to. As you imagine this period, picture a city easing into a new rhythm. Streets active but calm. People moving with purpose but without pressure. Life resuming gently. This was renewal without urgency. Change without disruption. Post-war Chicago did not abandon its past. It carried it forward carefully, allowing modern life to emerge slowly, guided by memory, balance, and the quiet confidence of a city that had learned how to endure and how to continue. Architecture continued to evolve. New structures appeared alongside older ones, reflecting continuity rather than replacement. Design focused on function, comfort, and longevity. The city's skyline shifted gradually, respecting what already stood. Economic life stabilized further. Planning extended naturally into the future. Confidence returned not as assumption but as earned trust. People believed in consistency more than promise. Education and learning continued to play a steady role. Schools reinforced routine while supporting adaptation. Knowledge moved forward quietly, shaping future generations without disruption. Time felt open again. Days were full but not heavy. Progress felt possible without feeling demanded. The city moved forward because it could, not because it had to. As you imagine this period, picture a city easing into a new rhythm. Streets active but calm, people moving with purpose but without pressure, life resuming gently. This was renewal without urgency, change without disruption. Post-war Chicago did not abandon its past. It carried it forward carefully, allowing modern life to emerge slowly, guided by memory, balance, and the quiet confidence of a city that had learned how to endure and how to continue. As the post-war years continued to unfold, the sense of renewal in Chicago became more deeply rooted in everyday life. The city did not surge forward in a burst of energy. Instead, it settled into a calm confidence, allowing change to arrive gradually and naturally. What defined this period was not speed, but steadiness, a feeling that life was moving forward without strain. Daily routines became more fluid. Work schedules felt reliable again, no longer interrupted by uncertainty. People moved through their days with quiet assurance, planning weeks and months ahead without hesitation. The future no longer felt distant or unclear. It felt reachable, shaped by ordinary effort and consistent rhythm. Neighborhood life continued to evolve gently. Streets felt fuller, yet still familiar. Children played without urgency. Adults returned home at predictable hours. Evenings unfolded calmly, shaped by shared meals, quiet conversation, and rest. The city regained its sense of balance, one household at a time. Industry adapted to modern demands with care. New methods appeared, but they did not erase what came before. Experience guided innovation. Factories and workplaces refined processes slowly, focusing on reliability rather than spectacle. Work felt purposeful, grounded in routine rather than ambition. Transportation became smoother and more integrated. Movement across the city felt easier, almost effortless. Travel was no longer something to plan carefully. It became part of daily life, supporting flexibility without disrupting routine. Distance felt smaller, less demanding. Public spaces reflected renewed comfort. Parks, streets, and gathering areas welcomed people back without pressure. Activity increased gently, never overwhelming. The city seemed to stretch, opening itself slightly wider while maintaining its calm center. Housing patterns adjusted quietly. Some areas grew denser, others grew quieter. These shifts happened without urgency or conflict. The city learned how to change shape while preserving continuity. Community remained intact even as patterns shifted. The city's soundscape softened into harmony. Daytime carried the steady noise of activity. Evenings returned to calm. Nights brought rest without interruption. The rhythm felt familiar, reassuring, and sustainable. Cultural life expanded modestly. Entertainment and shared experiences returned to public view, but they did not dominate daily life. They complemented it. Joy existed without excess. Celebration remained grounded. Economic confidence strengthened through repetition rather than promise. Stability was proven day by day. Planning became natural again. People trusted that effort would be met with continuity. This trust reduced anxiety and encouraged patience. Education continued to shape the city's future quietly. Schools reinforced structure while adapting to change. Learning moved forward steadily, preparing new generations for a city that valued balance over urgency. Time felt generous. Days moved evenly, weeks passed smoothly. Progress did not demand attention, it simply occurred. Life felt continuous rather than interrupted. The city's identity as a modern place took shape slowly. Modernity did not arrive as a break from the past, but as an extension of it. New ideas settled gently alongside established habits. The city remained itself while allowing itself to grow. As you imagine this phase, picture a city moving through an ordinary day with ease. Streets active but composed. People unhurried, the sense that everything is where it belongs. This was transformation without tension, modern life without loss of calm. Post-war Chicago did not redefine itself loudly. It refined itself quietly, allowing renewal to become routine and modern life to unfold naturally, supported by memory, balance, and the steady assurance that the city knew how to continue forward gently and without rush.